Well, good morning. Good. It's good to be in the room with many of you, and for those of you online, thank you for joining us. I'm glad that we could all continue to worship together, no matter what form we have to take. I mean, the stay-at-home thing has done a lot of different things to our rhythms. For me, one of the things that's impacted is my ability to play board games with people. That's been sad. If you know me, I really like board games, and so I'm going to focus back on one for a little bit because I haven't done it in a while. The board game is Risk, and so if you've ever played Risk or heard me talk about it before, because I've done that, the idea is that you gather a whole bunch of armies together and you take over the world. You don't win with anything less than total world domination. That is the goal. It's pretty fantastic. So, when you first play the game, you can get the sense that there's a lot of randomness involved because every battle involves rolling the die. So every once in a while, you can just have a really unlucky run. But if you play a couple times, you quickly learn that there's a lot of strategy to the game of Risk. That as you seek to conquer every country and take over the world, you can't expand too fast, you can't be vulnerable, you have to make sure that you're very careful in how you go about moving your armies. But if you play Risk even longer, you come to realize that strategy is not the most important thing. The most important aspect of winning a Risk game is psychology. You're not playing really against the armies on the board, you're playing against the people in the room. Because even if you have perfect strategy and you run ahead of everybody else, they're just going to gang up on you and take you back down. You have to play the people in the room. Now, when I was in junior high, a couple friends and I would always get together and play Risk, kind of like, every month or so. There were three of us. And I found a way to make it so that I won almost every game. It was pretty simple. And it didn't have to do with perfect strategy. It had everything to do with playing the people in the room. And so here's what I do in junior high, and this worked in junior high for me, is as we'd start to play the game, I'd throw out a couple of hypothetical questions, something like, who would win in a fight, Iron Man or the Hulk? I just kind of threw out a few of those until one stuck. And eventually my two friends, who were sort of the argumentative type, would get so involved in that debate that they would forget, really, that they're playing a Risk game. They'd be far more interested in the little squabble they've had amongst themselves. And if I could escalate it far enough, then they would do nothing but try to destroy each other on the Risk board because that's where it had gotten to. And man, it is the easiest thing in the world to win Risk if the other two players are only attacking each other. It's fantastic. But the image today, for us as a church, of course, is similar. We have a mission. We have a goal. We're part of this worldwide kingdom-building movement that God has called us to be. But along the way, division can thwart our ultimate objective. That we can get stuck in other conversations, things that may be important but are not quite the same as the Risk board. And in this world, when that happens, especially for us in the church, when there's division, it can really sabotage what it is we're trying to do as Christians following Jesus. We're calling this series Won't Stop Now because we've been taking this idea that the church, it's never stopped during this whole stay-at-home season. It never stopped being the church, but things have changed. And we've learned a lot of lessons about what it looks like to be the church in sort of the next season, right? We don't want to just go back to being who we were. We want to take the lessons that God has taught us and use those so that whatever comes next, we're better for it than when we started. And so that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to learn the lessons that we have as a church learned over the past several months. And here's a lesson. This is not exactly going to blow your mind, but here's a lesson that I've seen anyway. Christians disagree. I know. Look, we've always disagreed, but it has taken a particularly interesting form in the last several months. I mean, now when we disagree, I can't just go get coffee with someone and hash it out. So what has happened is our disagreements primarily exist in the public sphere. So that means that they're all over social media, and of course media proper also takes our disagreements and puts them before the world. And so here's what can happen, right? On a given day, I can open up my Facebook feed on the same day and see one article from someone who loves God and loves others. I can see one article that says the church is not being the church unless it opens its doors. And another article, couple posts down, says the church is not being the church unless it's being very careful to hold off opening its doors until our community is safe. And I can keep struggling, to kind of figure out what's going on Facebook. I can see one post that says the church is not being the church unless it's fully supporting the protesters. And of course, that it says the church is not being the church unless it's fully supporting the police officers. And now, because we're getting to that season, the church is not being the church unless it supports Joe Biden, and the church is not being the church unless it supports Donald Trump. This is my Facebook feed. I don't know if it's yours. Sometimes our Facebook feeds are similar. We have enough friends that think like us that they're kind of one thought. But for me, I hang out with all of y'all, and you all don't agree. And it shows up on my Facebook feed, and I can see it, right? These very important conversations that we have to have, but they can be exhausting sometimes. As a church staff, we were reading an article last week, and there was an author who said, it's felt like in this stay-at-home season, like we've had to take this giant swim, and we finally got out of the pool and realized that we are entering into a triathlon we didn't sign up for. We stepped into this pandemic season, full-heartedly swam as hard as we could. We got out, and someone handed us a bicycle. We just weren't ready for the bicycle, and now we're jumping on this bicycle, and we're looking ahead to like November and the election season and going, oh my gosh, I'm going to have to run half a marathon at the end of this thing. And it's exhausting. One thing after the next. It's only exhausting because we care. If we didn't care, well, we just wouldn't participate. We'd get off the bike and go home. But we care. We care about the things going on in our world. We care about how we as a church should step into these things. But the result is that we're going to disagree. And now, in our world, our disagreements are quite public. Probably more so than they've ever been in human history. When we disagree, it shows up on our social media feeds. When we disagree, the rest of the media catches on. And really, if you were to paint a picture of what the church is like just based on those two things, it would mostly be about people squabbling with each other. This is kind of what it looks like. Now, I know that's not the truth, but in the public sphere, that's kind of what's happened. Our disagreements get brought to light. And the danger then is that we could become disunified as a people of God. So we have to wrestle with this issue of what it means to be the church in the midst of a society, in the midst of challenges where we're not all going to agree on the best way to move forward. That's what we're going to try to do today. So if you would, turn to John chapter 17. We're going to look at something here. I want to give some credit to Andy Stanley. He's the one who kind of pointed me in this direction, and he did it mostly in terms of the political conversation. I'm going to take it a little broader. He pointed me toward this passage that I think is really important for us to know. And it happens in verse 20 of chapter 17. I want to tell you what's going on here, right? So Jesus, and particularly in the Gospel of John, Jesus knows that the next thing that's coming is his own death. He knows that that's what's on the horizon. So he has one more night, really, to impart to the disciples everything he wants them to learn and everything that they need to know. And it takes like 5 chapters in the Gospel of John to do all of these things. And the last chapter, Jesus begins to pray. And he prays to God for the disciples that have been in his care. And he knows that there's a lot of things that they need. They need protection because this world's going to be hard. They need to remember what their vision is. They need to follow Jesus because things are going to get really complicated. And so he prays for the disciples. But then Jesus does something that I have to imagine that even for the disciples sitting around the table was a little bit unusual. He stops praying for them, and he starts praying for us. Verse 20, my prayer is not for them, the disciples, alone. I pray also for those who will believe in me through their message. That's everyone else. That's all the multitude of generations that would come after the disciples who would hear the message of God's love, believe it, and live according to it. The church, those of us sitting in this room or watching online who have chosen to follow Christ. This prayer is for us. Whatever Jesus is about to say, it's not aimed just at the disciples. It's aimed at us. And there is no other prayer in the Gospels aimed directly at us like this. This is very unique. Jesus knows that this movement, this church movement, it's going to keep going. And he knows that future disciples are going to have some lessons learned or things are going to get really hard for them. And so he has one prayer, one thing that he wants the future church to know, one prayer to God that he would protect the future church in this way. You want to know what it is? Yeah, let's do it. Verse 21. That all of them, all of us, may be one. Father, just as you are in me and I am in you, may they also be in us so that the world may believe that you have sent me. I have given them the glory that you gave me, that they may be one as we are one, I and them and you and me, so that they all may be brought to complete unity. Complete unity, that we may be one. This is not a diverse message. This is singular in nature. There is one prayer Jesus prayed for us today. That's that we would be unified. Now, don't get me wrong. Jesus has lots of important things that he taught his disciples, things that we need to wrestle with that help us in our spiritual journey, help us understand how to interact in our culture. But there's only one prayer he prayed for us directly, that we may be one. See, Jesus, he has this relationship with God the Father where he is in perfect harmony with God. And he prays this for his disciples sitting around the table too, that they would be in harmony with each other. But his prayer is that for every generation that comes forward, that all future followers of Christ would be one. They would have complete unity. And there's a reason for this, and he ends verse 23 this way. Then the world will know that you sent me and have loved them even as you have loved me. If my believers, if my followers, if everyone who follows Jesus is in unity, that's how the world's going to know that this is a movement of God. That God actually sent Jesus into this world. That God has set up the church to be his voice in this world. The way that people will know that God is behind this is by their oneness, by their unity. That's the thing that's going to mark it as divine and unique and different, because nothing else in the world can carry that kind of unity that Jesus is hoping for. So that's it. That's our call. Our call is to be one. Our call is to be unified. And yet, we disagree. How does that work, right? How do we reconcile those two things? Because it's not exactly a hidden fact that the church, over the course of its history, has disagreed, has divided, right? It's not exactly a hidden fact that even just in our own particular local congregation, we disagree with each other. We don't all see everything the same way. So given that that's true, and that Jesus calls us to be unified, what do? It seems a paradox. I want to go back to the risk board because I think it can help us a little bit. See, the risk game is ultimately the call of the church. It's a movement of God in the world. It's seeing his kingdom come to full fruition, and we get to be a part of that. That's the big goal. And what I can say about the people in this room and the people that most of you I know that are online watching this is that is the goal that we carry. That's the big thing. Along the way, there are a ton of little decisions we have to make about how to engage this world, and we're not going to agree on those. Those are the little individual skirmishes, the little battles, right? There's more than one way to win a risk game. We're not always going to agree on those. Sometimes the disagreements are strategy. Sometimes the disagreements really are more on theology and what we believe. And all of those things are important, and all of those conversations matter. But I believe that Jesus is calling us to something that rises even above some of those things on which we disagree. And I want to look at how the early church dealt with it, because I think they can help us understand how we might move forward in unity even when we don't agree on every bit of strategy. So let's look at Acts chapter 15. In Acts chapter 15, you have the early church in a disagreement. They do not agree on what's going on. And the Bible, and I'm really glad for this, it doesn't sugarcoat that. It presents the fact that really, even the early Christians, they had disagreements. Check this out, Acts chapter 15, verses 1 and 2. Certain people came down from Judea to Antioch and were teaching the believers, unless you are circumcised according to the custom taught by Moses, you cannot be saved. This brought Paul and Barnabas into sharp dispute and debate with them. Sharp dispute and debate. Oh no! Disagreement. Oh no! The context here is that, of course, you have Christians who came from the Jewish tradition and Christians who now have come from non-Jewish traditions. We call them Gentiles. And they all came to Christianity differently. And the Jewish Christians, some of them were saying that if you're going to be a real Christian, you have to also adopt all of the Jewish customs. You have to do everything that a good Jewish person would do. And for Paul and for Barnabas, that felt like an unnecessary barrier that was going to keep people ultimately from experiencing the freedom of Christ. And so Paul and Barnabas were brought into sharp dispute and debate with this particular thought. There was disagreement. What's so fascinating about Acts chapter 15 is they actually walk us through everything that happened after this. And there were a couple different ways that they approached this conversation. The Christians gathered together. They assembled. They tried to hash these things out best they could. Some people presented rational arguments for their viewpoint. But the thing that I find most profound is what happens in verse 12. This is what Paul and Barnabas do when everyone's gathered together. The whole assembly became silent as they listened to Barnabas and Paul telling about the signs and wonders God had done among the Gentiles through them. Paul and Barnabas took a step back for a minute from the debate, from the rational arguments. They said, you know what, I want us to focus on what God's doing. Because God is doing something here that was beyond our understanding. We couldn't have figured it out at the start of this thing. God's moving beyond our imagination. And now God is changing the lives of people around the world in an incredible way. And even though they're standing in a room where people are passionately disagreeing with each other, they are all pointing now to the active work of God in and around their communities. And these stories begin to take center stage. The ways that God is speaking into people's lives. Many of you throughout this season have sent us stories or have told us stories about ways in which God is doing some incredible things through your neighbors or through your friends or through people all around the country really who are engaging with us that couldn't engage us before. And you're sharing these stories to say God is doing something even in the middle of a pandemic. We didn't know what it was going to be. We didn't know how it was going to happen, but God is going before us and doing something. There is a way, even when Christians disagree, for us to take a step back for a minute and point back to where God is already at work. And the question becomes a little less who's right and who's wrong. The question becomes where is God and how do we join him? Because that's where the good stuff is. Because this is God's game. And that brings us back into the conversation of what is the big purpose here? God's kingdom being made known in our world. And we're probably still not all going to agree going forward, but we can at least see where God's already moving and join him there. Now, what's fascinating, in Acts chapter 15, it just kind of hits you with two of these, right? Some time passes, but the very next section in chapter 15 is another disagreement. And this time, Paul and Barnabas, who were on the same side just a moment ago, now disagree with each other. Barnabas wanted to take John, also called Mark, with them onto their next missionary journey. But Paul did not think it wise to take him because he had deserted them in Pamphylia and had not continued with them in the work. They had such a sharp disagreement that they parted company. Sharp disagreement. Parted company. Oh no! Disagreement happens, even amongst heroes of the faith like Paul and Barnabas. And Scripture doesn't sugarcoat that for us either. It's right there. But you know what's fascinating? If you read the rest of the New Testament, every once in a while in Paul's letters, he references people that are doing good work for God throughout the world. And he'll reference both Barnabas and Mark in different letters. It's always positive. He's always explaining that God is doing something through these people. Even though their disagreement took them different ways, God was doing something. Somehow God's Spirit was at work, even in the disagreement. And it tells us exactly what that looked like in the next couple of verses. Verse 39, Barnabas took Mark and sailed for Cyprus, but Paul chose Silas and left, commended by the believers to the grace of the Lord. He went through Syria and Cilicia, strengthening the churches. You know what the result, Barnabas and Paul's disagreement was? Ministry multiplied. They were able to actually divide and conquer. They both had incredible journeys in front of them, and God used it. They may not have been able to fully agree on the strategy in the moment, but it wasn't as big as what God was doing. In fact, they were able to take their different convictions and callings and use that for the furtherance of the big goal, which is the spreading the kingdom of God. And they maintained a respect and love for each other even in the midst of that disagreement. Church, can we do that? Can we acknowledge that even when we're encountering someone who disagrees on something with us, even something we're really passionate about, that maybe God is doing something in their life and is calling them to something, or they might go places where we cannot? Because even in our disagreements, we can believe that God is doing something profound. I do not believe that unity is conformity. I don't. I believe that unity happens when even in our disagreements, we maintain the sense that God is doing something. We can have peace and discomfort at the same time. We cannot fully understand everything that's happening, but believe that God is moving his church to do powerful things in this world. But it has to start with a place of unity. And let me tell you how I think we get there. You see this in another pretty forceful command Jesus makes in the book of John. John chapter 13, verses 34. He says this to the disciples, "A new command I give you, love one another. As I have loved you, so you must love one another. By this everyone will know that you are my disciples, if you love one another." How will people know that you're my disciples? You love one another. How will people know that your movement is inspired by God? You show unity. Unity and love are tied together. We demonstrate unity as a church when we become obnoxious about how much we love each other. When the world looks into our community and says, man, they don't agree on things, but they keep loving each other. It subverts the agendas of our world, for sure. We live in a super tribalistic, polarizing society right now. We have so many forces that want to bring us into their camp on really important issues that we need to talk about. They matter. But can we be a place, a church, that loves each other so much that we refuse to be pitted against each other and see the other as our enemy? Can we be a church that loves each other so profoundly that even in our disagreements, we see the bigger picture that God is working through those people with whom we even disagree? Can we be that? I don't mean to pretend that there aren't going to be some really big disagreements, some really big challenges. They exist. They're hard and sometimes they're even heartbreaking. But in my experience, most of our disagreements are small. They're matters of strategy. They're matters of something happening right here and right now that will be different in 2 weeks. And why those conversations are really important. Can we give each other enough grace to say, you know what, none of us have this all figured out? And ultimately, my love for each and every one of you supersedes any place where we might not see eye to eye. Because we step back and we look at the whole risk board and we recognize that I might not agree with how every little battle plays out, but I believe that the church is moving forward to make this kingdom of God known to a world that needs it desperately. And we do that together in love, and we do that together in unity because we care for each other. I'm serious. I want us to be obnoxious about it. I really do. I want to get to the point where people are just annoyed with how much the church keeps showing its love and affection for each other. That's where I want us to get. See, in our world right now, with everything being public on social media or media proper, all of our disagreements are out there. So it kind of comes to us to decide if we're actually going to show displays of unity or not. And I don't want to tell you what that should look like for you. For each person, it's going to be different. But I wonder if there's a way that we can use the influence we have, use the platforms we have to say, hey, even with everything going on, all these crazy challenges in the world, we love our church. We love the people in our church. We love what they're doing, even the ones we disagree with. We love them. Is there a way to take the platforms that we have and say, you know what, we are a unified people? It's not that we all conform to every point, but we know what the big picture is. We know what the goal is. And even if we're going to disagree along the way, we're all heading toward that same goal, to see God's kingdom made known and glorified in our world now and forever. We're not going to stop. So I'll tell you what that step is for me today. And again, I'm not prescribing anything. You can do whatever it is that you feel like is best for your circles of influence. I went back through my own Facebook feed. My wife is really good at Facebook or Instagram or all those things. I'm not. So I looked back and I noticed that the last 10 entries, they all have a super common theme. They're all anniversaries, birthdays for my wife or my daughter, where I'm just saying how awesome they are because I do think that they're awesome. I can understand then if you get bored looking at my feed because, well, it's pretty much the same thing every time. So I'm going to do something different today. Today I'm going to post a different post. And this one's not going to be about my wife or about my daughter. This one's going to be about you all. And actually, this is the second service now. In first service, Kristen posted it for me live while I was reading through these things. I'm going to read it to you right now. To my church, we are in a challenging season. Our world has changed dramatically in the last 4 months, and it will likely keep changing. I know that we don't all agree on how to best respond to the challenges before us, but let me tell you what I have seen. Since we were first told to shelter in place, I have seen you redouble your efforts to provide food to those who could no longer afford it. I've seen you make it a priority to call, text, and Zoom each other so that no one would be forgotten while we stayed at home. I've seen you connect with our community through worship online, even if that felt unfamiliar. I have seen you take every precaution to keep others safe as we begin to gather again in person. From a place of love, I've seen you both attend protests. I've seen you reach out to police officers during a time when our nation is divided. Your love for our community and your love for each other are the reasons that my job as a pastor is a complete joy. The road before us is unplowed. But as we step into this next season together, I need you to know this. I love my church. I'm happy to be obnoxious about that. The worship team's going to come up, and we're going to spend just a little more time worshiping God together as one in unity. Again, I can't prescribe what displays, what circles of influence you want to utilize to help people understand that we are a unified people. I don't know what that looks like for you. It's going to be different. But can we be a people who change the narrative? who know that there's disagreements, good, important ones with big, important conversations, and yet love each other anyway. I don't think we stop. I've learned so much in this last season from many of you who post really helpful articles. I've seen that on Facebook, I've seen that on Instagram. They've helped me as I've wrestled with certain issues. Thank you. Keep doing that. Do it in a spirit of love and grace. But even as we post about these things that are happening in our world, can we find ways to tell the world that we love each other? That we have one mission, and that is to see the kingdom of God made known in this world. And however we get there, we're in it together. We are one, following wherever it is that God leads us in love and unity. God, today, I pray that you would continue to foster the joy that we have in our hearts to be a people of God together. I pray, of course, that you would unify the church, big C, the church universal. But God, today, in many ways, my heart is just at a place where I pray that you unify this one little church here, this local church. That even as we don't always agree on how to respond to things, that God, you would increase our love for each other, increase our sense of unity, increase our sense that you are calling us in one direction. God, may we give everything. May we give you our minds, the way this we think. May we give you our hearts, the things that we're passionate about. May we lay it on the table and say, God, all of these things, we submit to you and we submit to where you're going in this world. And we want to do it together. So God, increase our unity. Increase our love and be glorified through it. In your name we pray.